Tonight, we're diving into what life was really like in the richest city on earth, exploring how religion controlled society, how ordinary people practiced their faith, and what it cost to believe in a city overflowing with gold. If you enjoy calm, immersive history that reveals the hidden sides of the past, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. I'd love to hear what part of history fascinates you most. And when you're done, check out the other videos on the channel for more untold stories from history. Perfect for learning or listening as you drift off to sleep. What if I told you that, 300 years ago, the richest city on earth wasn't London or Paris, but Lisbon? In the early 1700s, gold and diamonds poured in from Brazil. Churches were lined with unimaginable wealth, and faith ruled daily life, publicly pious, privately complicated. But behind the glittering altars and grand processions, life in Lisbon wasn't just about riches. It was about belief, fear, power, and survival in a city where faith shaped everything from how people lived to how they died. Now, let's step into Lisbon in the 1700s. Before the sun rises, Lisbon is already awake. Not loudly, not proudly, just awake in the way a city gets when it has learned to expect things from the sea. The Tagus River lies wide and still, breathing slowly in the dark. Ships sit at anchor like animals that traveled all night and now rest without asking permission. Their hulls creak softly, ropes knock against wood. Somewhere an oar dips into the water, then lifts again, leaving a small circle that disappears almost immediately. Lisbon does not greet the morning with celebration. It greets it with routine. Bells ring not urgently, not joyfully, but because they always do. A church announces itself to the fog. Another answers back. The sound travels over tiled rooftops and narrow streets, bouncing between hills, reminding everyone that the day has started whether they are ready or not. This is Lisbon in the early 1700s, the richest city on earth. Though you would not know it from the silence. There is no line of people counting gold, no cheering crowds, no grand moment where someone declares success. The wealth is already here. It arrived quietly, years ago, ship by ship, crate by crate, and then settled in like damp air. Most people in the city have never seen it up close. They wake in dark rooms with low ceilings. They share space with children, with cousins, with strangers who rent a corner of the floor. They step carefully over sleeping bodies and go outside while the streets are still half empty and half broken. The richest city in the world smells like old fish and whetstone before sunrise. Down by the river, dockworkers begin to move. They do not rush. They know the ships are not going anywhere. The ships always come back. That is the rule now. Brazil sends gold. Africa sends people. India sends spices. Lisbon receives everything and gives very little back. The men on the docks do not talk about empire. They talk about sore shoulders, about the weather, about how long the day will be. They lift crates they will never open and guide barrels whose contents will never belong to them. Above them, on higher ground, the city watches quietly. Lisbon is built on hills, and even at dawn, you can feel that some people wait closer to the sky than others. The higher neighborhoods catch the first light. Their windows glow faintly. Somewhere behind stone walls, someone stirs beneath a heavy blanket, unaware that the city below is already working to support their comfort. This is how wealth works here. It does not announce itself. It rests on top of things. If you stood on a hill and looked down toward the river, you might think Lisbon was simply busy. Ships, churches, markets preparing to open. Nothing that screams richest city on earth. London feels louder. Paris feels grander. Amsterdam feels sharper and cleaner. Lisbon feels older, slower, almost tired. But the ships tell a different story. Some carry sugar. Some carry tobacco. Others carry heavy chests that require careful handling and strong backs. Gold from Brazil flows through the city in a steady stream, not as coins passed hand to hand, but as raw promise. It arrives, is recorded, is taxed, and then moves on again, toward palaces, toward churches, toward royal vaults, toward foreign creditors. It rarely stops long enough to be admired. That is the strange thing about Lisbon's wealth. It is everywhere and almost nowhere at the same time. The average person brushing past these ships will never touch it. They might feel its effects: higher prices, stricter laws, heavier church authority, but the gold itself stays distant, untouchable, like a rumor that turned out to be true, just not for you. As the sky lightens, the city becomes louder. Footsteps multiply. Vendors set up stalls. Someone curses as a cartwheel sticks in the mud. A stray dog weaves between legs, already looking for scraps that will come later. Lisbon wakes up the same way it always does. No one says, "We are rich." They say, "Another day." And yet, this city sits at the center of a world-spanning network. Goods move through Lisbon the way blood moves through a heart. Not gently, not evenly, but constantly. The city does not produce most of what makes it wealthy. It receives it, collects it, passes it upward. From the outside, Lisbon looks like success. From the inside, it feels like pressure. Church bells grow louder now as services approach. Candles will soon be lit. Gold will soon gleam inside dark sanctuaries, where people pray not for riches, but for stability, for health, for one more day without trouble. Very few people in Lisbon believe the wealth will ever stop. It has been coming for decades. Why would it end now? Ships still arrive. The river still provides. God still favors the empire, at least according to the sermons. The palaces still expand. The churches still grow heavier with decoration. Everything feels permanent enough. And permanence is convincing. If you live in a city long enough, especially one that seems blessed by distance and water and fortune, you stop imagining collapse. You stop imagining loss. You start thinking in terms of routine instead of risk. Lisbon has reached that point. It believes, quietly, that this is how things are meant to be. As the sun finally clears the horizon, its light slides across rooftops and tiled walls. It catches on church domes and high windows. It touches the river last, turning the water pale gold for a moment that feels almost symbolic, though no one pauses to notice. The city is fully awake now. Merchants prepare to count profits they did not earn alone. Servants prepare homes they do not own. Priests prepare sermons funded by wealth that arrived in chains and coffins. Dockworkers prepare their backs for another long day beneath ships that connect Lisbon to half the planet. Everyone has a role. Everyone believes the city will continue exactly as it is. And standing here, watching Lisbon move through another ordinary morning, it is hard not to believe it too. After all, this is the richest city on earth. What could possibly take that away? The answer, for now, remains quiet. Lisbon did not plan to become the richest city on earth. It did not hold meetings about it. It did not design grand strategies with charts and projections. It mostly just waited by the water and accepted what arrived. The city's wealth began far away, in places most Lisbon residents would never see. Dense forests, hot rivers, mining camps carved into unfamiliar land. Brazil, in particular, changed everything. When gold was found there in serious quantities, Lisbon became the funnel through which it all had to pass. Not some of it, all of it. By law, Brazilian gold belonged to the Portuguese crown. Ships carried it across the Atlantic in guarded convoys. When they reached Lisbon, the city did not celebrate. It processed. Officials weighed, counted, recorded. A portion went directly to the king. Another portion went to pay debts. Another portion vanished into church projects, foreign payments, and private hands. Gold entered Lisbon like water into sand, visible for a moment, then gone. This is why Lisbon's wealth felt strange. It was massive, but not tactile. You could live your whole life beside it and never feel heavier for it. The city itself benefited. Buildings grew larger, churches shinier, authorities stricter, but the people did not suddenly eat better or work less. Lisbon became rich without becoming comfortable. Unlike cities that grew wealthy through manufacturing or banking, Lisbon's riches depended on movement. Ships arriving, ships leaving, cargo changing hands. The city functioned like a giant mouth, swallowing goods and sending them onward. Brazil sent gold and diamonds. Africa sent enslaved people. India sent spices, textiles, and luxury goods. Lisbon stood still and let the world come to it. This made the city powerful, but also oddly hollow. The wealth did not circulate widely. It climbed upward, toward palaces, bishops, foreign lenders, and the royal court. The rest of the city watched it pass by like a parade. They were not invited to join. Compared to London or Amsterdam, Lisbon felt different. Those cities buzzed with merchants reinvesting profits, with workshops, banks, and industries multiplying. Lisbon had merchants too, but many were middlemen. They moved goods rather than transforming them. Think of Lisbon less as a factory and more as a very fancy loading dock. Paris had spectacle. London had noise. Amsterdam had precision. Lisbon had roots. From the Atlantic, ships could reach Africa, Brazil, and beyond. From Lisbon, goods could move into Europe. The city sat perfectly placed, and it knew it. Geography did most of the work. The rest was habit. Gold especially changed the rhythm of the city. When large shipments arrived, activity increased. Officials tightened controls. Guards doubled. The church prepared new projects. Architects sharpened their quills. Everyone upstream from the docks felt the current shift. Downstream, life stayed mostly the same. Bread still cost too much. Rooms stayed crowded. Work stayed exhausting. The idea that Lisbon was rich existed mostly in paperwork and stone. You could see it in churches wrapped in gold leaf, so thick it almost felt aggressive. You could see it in royal processions and foreign visitors writing home in disbelief. But you would not see it in the hands of the people carrying water uphill or hauling nets from the river. Lisbon's wealth was concentrated, not shared. That was not a flaw in the system. That was the system. And because the gold kept coming, no one questioned it too deeply. Why would they? As long as ships arrived, the city felt chosen, protected, favored by distance and God and luck. There was also something comforting about wealth that came from elsewhere. Lisbon did not need to exhaust its own land or people to grow rich. It outsourced that suffering. The mines were far away. The plantations were across the ocean. The violence happened somewhere else. In Lisbon, the results looked clean. This distance made it easier to believe the riches were deserved, or at least inevitable. People spoke less about where the gold came from, and more about where it would go next. New churches, new palaces, new displays of devotion and authority. The city grew accustomed to receiving without reflecting. And so, Lisbon expanded upward and outward. Buildings became taller, decorations became heavier, authority became more confident. The city began to behave like something permanent, something unshakable, which is ironic, considering it was built on hills, loose soil, and borrowed wealth. Still, to live in Lisbon at this time was to live inside a quiet assumption that tomorrow would look like today, and today looked rich enough to last forever. Ships would come, gold would pass through, the city would remain standing. That belief settled into daily life. It shaped laws, sermons, habits. It shaped how little people worried about the future. When wealth feels endless, imagination shrinks. You stop planning for change. Lisbon did not think of itself as fragile. It thought of itself as essential, and in a way, it was. For decades, the flow did not stop. The city became Europe's overlooked giant, not loud, not proud, but impossibly well-fed. Other nations noticed. They envied it. They borrowed from it. They depended on it. Lisbon became rich by standing still, while the world moved around it. And standing still, for a long time, felt like strength. By the time most people realized how much the city relied on things it could not, control ships, seas, distant mines, it felt unnecessary to worry. After all, the gold had always arrived before. Why wouldn't it arrive again tomorrow? With that quiet confidence settled firmly in place, Lisbon went on with its day. The river stayed busy. The hills stayed crowded. The wealth kept flowing, mostly upward, mostly unseen. And the city, perched between water and sky, believed it had all the time in the world. If Lisbon had a pulse, it would be felt first at the river. The Tagus is wide here, wide enough to feel less like a river and more like a paused ocean. It does not rush. It does not announce itself. It simply waits, and in waiting, it controls everything. The city bends toward it without admitting that it does. From early morning to late night, the Tagus is never truly still. At dawn, small boats slip across its surface, oars dipping quietly, as if trying not to wake it. Fishermen check nets. Messengers cross from one side to the other. The water smells of salt, old wood, and something faintly sweet that might be spice or might be rot. In Lisbon, it is often hard to tell the difference. As the day grows brighter, the river becomes crowded. Ships line up like guests who arrived early and refuse to leave. Some are enormous, dark with travel, their sides stained by long months at sea. Others are smaller, local, practical. All of them carry weight, cargo, people, expectations. The river does not care what they bring. The city does. Dock workers move in practiced rhythms. They do not look at the horizon much anymore. They look at ropes, crates, ledges. Their hands are rough. Their clothes are stiff with salt. They know which ships mean harder days and which ones mean danger. A ship from Brazil draws attention. A ship from Africa draws silence. Customs officials hover nearby, watchful and tired. They count, they mark, they check seals. They argue over documents written in careful ink that pretends everything here is orderly. Sometimes it is. Often it is not. Lisbon's wealth passes through these hands first, but never lingers. A dock worker may carry gold once in his life, and only as a box that feels heavier than it should. He will not open it. He will not benefit from it. He will simply move it from ship to shore, to cart, to somewhere higher up the hill. The Tagus is not just a river. It is a conveyor belt. At midday, the noise rises. Sailors shout in languages that clash with one another. Barrels roll. Cranes groan. Animals panic. Somewhere, someone always falls into the water, and someone else always pulls them back out. No one stops working for long. The river divides Lisbon in ways the hills cannot. On one side is arrival, on the other is departure. Hope and exhaustion trade places constantly. For every person stepping onto land believing they have reached the center of opportunity, another is stepping onto a ship because they have run out of options. The Tagus has seen both too many times to react. This is where Lisbon feels most honest. Away from palaces, away from churches. Down here, wealth smells bad and sounds unpleasant. It is heavy, awkward, and demanding. It requires backs and patience. It requires people willing to touch what others prefer to discuss abstractly. Spices spill sometimes, filling the air with sudden sweetness. Fish rot quickly in the sun. Tar sticks to shoes. Rats appear without embarrassment. This is the cost of movement, and the city pays it daily. And still, people come. Merchants pace the docks, watching their goods with anxious eyes. Some are local, many are foreign. They dress better than the workers, but worse than the nobles. They belong to the river in a different way. They live by its timing. A delayed ship means a delayed fortune. A storm at sea can ruin a year. For them, the Tagus is not scenery. It is a schedule. Lisbon's power does not sit on thrones or behind altars. It sits right here, where cargo changes hands, where paperwork becomes wealth, where a crate unloaded in silence might fund a palace no one asked for. From the river, the city rises abruptly. Hills climb away from the water as if trying to escape it. Streets angle upward, growing narrower, darker, more personal. The further you climb, the quieter the river becomes, until it is only a memory carried by carts and servants and money. But the river never truly lets go. Everything in Lisbon points back to it. Prices, laws, sermons, fear, opportunity. If the river stopped, the city would starve in ways it does not like to imagine. That is why the Tagus is guarded, not lovingly, but carefully. Forts watch the mouth of the river. Cannons face outward. The message is clear. What comes through here belongs to Lisbon, and Lisbon intends to keep it that way. The river also acts as a kind of social mirror. The closer you work to it, the harder your life usually is. Sailors sleep in tight quarters. Dock workers age quickly. Enslaved people are marched through these spaces without ceremony. Meanwhile, those who profit most from the river often experience it from balconies or carriages, if at all. They know it exists. They simply do not smell it. As evening approaches, the pace slows but never stops. Ships settle again. The river darkens. Reflections of buildings stretch across the surface, distorted and unsteady. Fires are lit along the shore. Food appears. Wine flows. Laughter mixes with fatigue. For a few hours, the river feels almost gentle. But even at night, the Tagus keeps working. Tides shift. Ships adjust. Guards patrol. Somewhere, plans are being made for what will arrive next week, next month, next year. Lisbon sleeps with one ear open, listening for the river. Because as long as the Tagus moves, the city believes it will live. It is easy, standing here, to think the river will always provide. It has done so for decades. It feels ancient, patient, reliable, the kind of thing that outlasts human worry. That belief sinks deep into Lisbon's bones. The river has always been here. The ships keep coming. The wealth keeps flowing. And so the city builds higher, heavier, more confident. It does not ask what happens if the river one day gives less. It simply listens to the water, trusts the rhythm, and carries on unaware that even the widest rivers have limits, and even the calmest surfaces can hide trouble beneath. Lisbon does not sit politely on the land. It climbs it. The city spreads itself over a series of steep hills that rise sharply from the river, as if Lisbon wanted to get as far away from the water as possible, while still depending on it completely. Streets twist upward without apology. Staircases appear where roads give up. Houses lean into one another for balance. If you live here, you learn early that nothing is flat, not the streets, not the city, and definitely not society. In Lisbon, where you live vertically, matters almost as much as who you are. Down near the river, the streets are crowded and loud. This is where work arrives first. It is also where smells gather. Fish, mud, sweat, refuse, smoke. The ground stays damp. Sunlight struggles to reach between tightly packed buildings. The lower districts are busy, noisy, and worn thin by use. As you climb upward, things change. The air improves slightly. The streets widen just enough to feel intentional. Houses grow sturdier. Windows appear larger. Light lasts longer here. People walk more slowly, not because the hill is easier, but because they can afford to. Lisbon's social structure is built directly into its geography. The higher you go, the fewer people you find. The fewer people you find, the more power they tend to have. This is not written in law, but everyone understands it. Nobles and wealthy families live on elevated ground, away from the damp and the crowds. Their homes catch the morning sun and avoid the worst smells of the docks. From their windows, the city looks orderly, almost peaceful. Down below, the city looks different. Homes in the lower districts are stacked tightly, sometimes 3 or 4 families to a building, never meant to hold that many. Rooms are small, ceilings are low. Privacy is more of an idea than a reality. If someone argues, everyone hears it. If someone cooks, everyone smells it. And if someone gets sick, everyone worries. Lisbon's hills create a strange sense of compression. Space is limited, so people build upward. Narrow buildings stretch tall, each floor holding another family, another story, another version of survival. Staircases creak under constant use. Light fades quickly as you climb higher inside these buildings, even as you climb lower socially. Sunlight becomes a kind of luxury. In wealthier areas, rooms are designed to catch it. Windows are positioned carefully. Courtyards allow light to pool gently. In poorer districts, sunlight feels accidental. It appears briefly, then disappears behind walls and roofs. No one talks about this openly, but everyone notices. Children in lower neighborhoods grow up straight-legged. You have to be, when every errand involves stairs. Water must be carried uphill. Firewood must be hauled. Food must be transported from markets below. Gravity works against you constantly, and Lisbon never apologizes for it. For the poor, the city is physical labor before the workday even begins. For the wealthy, the hills are protection. Distance from noise, distance from crowds, distance from the people whose labor makes the city run. Height creates separation, and separation feels like safety. This vertical divide shapes how people see one another. The wealthy rarely walk downhill without purpose. The poor walk uphill only when necessary, and usually not for long. Entire lives unfold within specific elevations of the city. You were born at a certain height. You likely stay there. Lisbon's streets reinforce this. Many are so narrow that carts struggle to pass. Some stairways are steep enough to discourage anyone without reason from climbing them. The city almost seems designed to keep people where they belong, according to unwritten rules everyone follows. And yet, the city is always moving. Servants climb hills daily to reach the homes they maintain but do not belong to. Messengers run up and down carrying information that holds more value than their own lives. Water sellers haul barrels upward, step by step, while nobles complain about the taste. The hills are not empty barriers, they are filters. If you are strong enough, desperate enough, or required enough, you move through them. Otherwise, you stay put. Lisbon's inequality is not hidden. It is visible in every breathless climb and careful descent. The city does not pretend to be equal. It simply functions. What makes this inequality feel normal is how long it has existed. Generations grow up assuming this is how cities work. Some people live higher. Some people work harder. Some people get sun. Some people get shade. This is not seen as cruelty. It is seen as order. Even churches reflect this structure. Many are built on elevated ground, rising above neighborhoods like moral landmarks. From below, they look grand and unreachable. From above, they look reassuringly central. Religion, like wealth, sits higher up. At night, the divide becomes clearer. Wealthier districts glow with candlelight behind thick windows. Lower areas rely on shared lamps, on reflected light, on moonlight when they are lucky. Darkness settles faster down here, and with darkness comes vulnerability. Crime, illness, accidents, all feel closer in the lower parts of the city. Not necessarily more common, but more immediate. There is less space to avoid trouble, less distance between lives. Above, problems feel manageable. Below, they feel personal. Lisbon's hills do something else too. They create perspective. From higher ground, the city looks almost calm. Rooftops stretch toward the river. Smoke rises gently. The chaos below compresses into something picturesque. This makes it easy to believe things are fine. If you live up high, Lisbon looks successful, alive, blessed. If you live down low, Lisbon feels crowded, heavy, and always one bad day away from disaster. Both views exist at the same time, and because people rarely cross between them without reason, the city never fully sees itself. This vertical separation keeps empathy at a distance. It allows wealth to exist beside poverty without constant confrontation. It allows comfort to feel earned and hardship to feel inevitable. Lisbon does not need walls to divide its people. The hills do that work quietly. By the early 1700s, this structure feels permanent. Streets are worn into the slopes. Buildings settle into place. Families remain where they are. The city stops imagining change. When you live on a hill long enough, you stop thinking about what might shake it. Lisbon stands confidently on its uneven ground, stacked with lives, routines, and assumptions. It believes the slopes are stable, that the city has found its balance. It does not consider how quickly balance can be lost. For now, the hills hold. The city breathes. Life continues upward and downward, day after day, and Lisbon, rich beyond measure and divided by elevation, carries an unaware that even the strongest slopes can give way, and even the highest ground is not as secure as it feels. If you follow the hills far enough upward, the city changes its voice. The noise fades. The streets widen. Footsteps sound different on better stone. Here, Lisbon does not rush. It pauses, it poses. This is where wealth finally becomes visible. Palaces rise behind walls that do not invite curiosity. Their facades are wide and confident, designed less for comfort than for impression. They face the city like actors holding a pose, waiting to be admired. From the outside, they promise warmth, ease, and elegance. Inside, they are often cold. Stone floors hold the night's chill well into the day. Large rooms echo when walked through alone, which they often are. Fires burn in some chambers, but not all. Comfort is selective. These buildings are meant to be seen, not necessarily lived in. Lisbon's richest families do not measure success by how pleasant their homes feel. They measure it by how impressive they look. Gold leaf covers ceilings, frames, altars, and walls. It does not always make rooms brighter. Sometimes it just makes them heavier. The gold catches candlelight and holds it, giving the illusion of warmth even when the air remains cool. Much of this gold comes from Brazil. Raw wealth transformed into surface decoration. It does not sit in vaults doing nothing. It is pressed flat and applied everywhere it can be noticed. Churches receive the thickest layers. In a city this wealthy, faith becomes a display. Altars shine so brightly they almost distract from prayer. Columns glow, angels gleam. It is difficult to feel humble beneath so much reflection, but that is part of the point. Wealth here is not just tolerated by religion, it is presented as proof. Proof of favor, proof of order, proof that Lisbon matters. Palaces mimic this style. Rooms are designed to overwhelm guests before conversation begins. Tapestries tell stories of power and conquest. Chandeliers drip light downward like captured stars. Furniture is ornate, sometimes uncomfortable, but always expensive. Many of these rooms are rarely used. That is one of the quiet truths of Lisbon's wealth. There is so much of it, and it is so unevenly distributed that it becomes ceremonial. Spaces exist for moments that may never come. Chairs wait for visitors who rarely arrive. Tables stand ready for feasts that happen once a year. Wealth here is aspirational, even for those who have it. Nobles spend more time maintaining appearances than enjoying them. Clothing must be correct. Servants must be trained. Guests must be impressed. A mistake is not just embarrassing, it is a crack in the image. An image is everything. Lisbon's elite live under a strange pressure. They are surrounded by abundance, but trapped by expectation. Their wealth ties them to the crown, the church, and foreign interests. They owe loyalty upward and generosity outward. Donations are not optional. Displays are required. Even comfort becomes political. You cannot simply relax when your home represents status. Fires must burn at the right times. Rooms must remain presentable. Servants move quietly, constantly, correcting small imperfections before they can be noticed. Silence fills these spaces, but it is not peaceful silence. It is waiting silence. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the city presses close. Crowded neighborhoods sit just downhill. Narrow streets echo with voices, carts, animals. The contrast is sharp. but carefully managed. High walls, guarded entrances, distance created by elevation. From a palace window, Lisbon looks almost orderly. From the street below, palaces look untouchable. This separation allows wealth to feel clean, removed, safe. Those inside do not have to confront the labor that supports their lifestyle every hour of the day. Servants appear, tasks are completed, and discomfort disappears quietly. The system works because it is designed to feel natural. Churches play a key role in this performance. Religious processions wind through the city, passing both slums and palaces, reminding everyone that hierarchy is divinely observed. Gold-covered statues move through muddy streets, carried by men who will never own anything that shines. The message is subtle but constant. This order is not accidental. Even foreign visitors comment on it. They write home about Lisbon's churches, its displays of wealth, its strange mixture of devotion and extravagance. Some admire it, others are unsettled by it. Few question it openly. Lisbon's wealth is not shy, but it is also oddly static. Money does not flow into innovation or infrastructure at the pace one might expect. It flows into reinforcement of authority, of tradition, of image. New churches replace old ones. Palaces grow more elaborate. Symbols multiply. This gives the city a sense of grandeur without resilience. Everything looks solid. Everything feels heavy. And yet, much of it exists for show. Rooms built to impress are not built to adapt. Decorations meant to display wealth add weight without adding strength. The city grows beautiful, but not flexible. No one thinks this matters. After all, Lisbon is rich. What could threaten it? Inside palaces, conversations drift toward politics, marriages, favors. People discuss shipments and donations in abstract terms. Gold is talked about, not touched. Its presence is assumed, like the sea beyond the hills. Outside, people pass these buildings without slowing down. They know better than to stare too long. Palaces are not for them. They are landmarks, not destinations. Children grow up knowing which streets lead upward to places they will never enter. Adults learn to work around these spaces, not through them. And so the performance continues. Lisbon's wealth becomes a kind of theater. Everyone has a role. Nobles display power. The church sanctifies it. The poor support it. The city itself provides the stage. It works because it feels stable. Gold does not rust. Stone does not bend easily. Buildings that have stood for decades feel eternal. People begin to confuse durability with permanence. They stop imagining loss. Standing in one of these palaces, surrounded by gold and silence, it is easy to believe Lisbon has outgrown uncertainty, that it has secured its place in the world through sheer abundance. The floors feel solid. The walls feel thick. The wealth feels endless. In Lisbon, you do not need to look for the church. You hear it first. Bells ring constantly. Morning bells, midday bells, evening bells. Bells for mass, for funerals, for warnings, for celebrations that most people are not invited to. The sound rolls over rooftops and down hills, settling into streets and homes like dust. It is impossible to escape. Churches dominate Lisbon's skyline and its schedule. No matter where you stand, one is always nearby. Often more than one. Their towers rise above neighborhoods like reminders that someone is always watching, and someone always knows what time it is. In the richest city on earth, faith and wealth do not compete. They cooperate. Lisbon's churches are not modest places. They are heavy with decoration, wrapped in gold that reflects candlelight until walls seem to glow from within. Altars shine brighter than most homes. Statues were expressions of calm authority. Everything about these spaces suggests order, stability, and divine approval. Gold is everywhere here, and no one pretends it is accidental. The message is clear. This wealth did not arrive by chance. It arrived because God allowed it to. This idea comforts many people, especially those who benefit from the arrangement. For the wealthy, the church offers reassurance. Donations become proof of virtue. Funding a chapel or altar cleanses the uneasy feeling that comes from knowing where the gold originated. If wealth builds churches, then wealth must be good, or at least forgivable. For the poor, the church offers structure. Life in Lisbon is crowded, uncertain, and physically demanding. The church provides rhythm. Days are marked by bells, weeks by services, years by festivals and fasts. Even when money is scarce, the calendar remains dependable. You may not control your life, but you know when to kneel. Churches are also places of gathering. In neighborhoods where homes are cramped and privacy is rare, Churches provide space, cool, quiet, and dimly lit. For a moment, people can sit without working, without being watched too closely by neighbors. Of course, they are still being watched. Priests know their communities well. They know who attends regularly and who does not, who donates, who whispers, who is struggling. The church hears everything, either in confession or in gossip, that drifts naturally toward authority. This makes the church Lisbon's emotional center. It absorbs fear, guilt, gratitude, and resentment, and releases them in manageable portions. Sermons speak often of order, of patience, of accepting one's place. Wealth is described as responsibility, poverty as a test. Both conditions are temporary, at least in theory. Eternity is what matters. This idea keeps people calm. If life is hard now, it will make sense later. If others have more, it is because they were chosen to manage it. Lisbon's church does not ask too many dangerous questions. The city's wealth pours into religious spaces at an astonishing rate. Entire interiors are covered in gold leaf. Some churches feel less like places of worship and more like vaults that learned how to pray. Visitors stand quietly, unsure whether to admire the craftsmanship or reflect on the message. Often they do both. The gold serves another purpose too. It keeps the wealth visible but controlled. Instead of coins circulating among the population, gold becomes architecture, decoration, something to be looked at, not used. This removes temptation while reinforcing hierarchy. You cannot steal an altar easily. You cannot argue with a cathedral. Religious processions wind through Lisbon's streets regularly. Statues are carried downhill and uphill, passing through every kind of neighborhood. The poor line the streets. The wealthy observe from windows. Everyone participates, but not equally. The church moves through the city the way authority should present everywhere, belonging fully to no one. These events are loud, colorful, and carefully organized. They remind people that Lisbon is united under faith, even if daily life suggests otherwise. For a few hours, inequality blurs beneath shared ritual. Then the statues return to their churches, and the city returns to itself. Fear plays an important role here. Lisbon is a crowded place. Fires break out icily, disease spreads quickly. The river brings opportunity, but also danger. Storms, shortages, accidents. People live close to disaster without naming it. The church gives those fears somewhere to go. Prayers are offered for safety. Candles are lit for protection. Donations are made after near misses. Survival feels conditional, and the church positions itself as the intermediary. In a city this wealthy, anxiety does not disappear. It simply becomes spiritual. Bells ring during emergencies. They ring differently. People know the sound. It cuts through conversation and movement, pulling attention upward. Even those who rarely attend services pause when they hear it. The bells mean something matters. Over time, this constant presence shapes how people think. Wealth becomes linked to righteousness. Authority becomes sacred. Questioning the structure of the city feels uncomfortably close to questioning God. Most people choose silence instead. This does not mean everyone believes deeply. Many attend services out of habit, expectation, or fear of being noticed. But belief does not have to be passionate to be effective. It only has to be consistent. And the church is very consistent. Children grow up surrounded by religious imagery, gold angels, painted saints, scenes of suffering and reward. They learn early that obedience is virtuous and endurance is holy. This fits neatly with life in Lisbon, where endurance is required daily. For the wealthy, the church offers legitimacy. For the poor, it offers explanation. For the city itself, it offers control. It also absorbs an enormous amount of money. Donations flow upward, quietly and regularly. Some are voluntary, others are expected. A wealthy family that does not contribute risks social suspicion. A merchant who fails to give appears ungrateful. The system reinforces itself gently but firmly. And because churches are beautiful, few complain. There is something hypnotic about gold-covered sanctuaries. They distract from hard questions. They encourage reflection without analysis. You feel small, and smallness can be comforting when life is heavy. Lisbon's church does not shout its authority. It rings it, day after day, year after year. The bells continue. They mark time in a city obsessed with routine. They tie the present to the past. They promise stability in a world that depends on distant ships and fragile systems. As long as the bells ring, people believe things are under control. No one wonders what would happen if they stopped. For now, the sound fills the air, echoing off hills and down streets. stitching the city together with rhythm and reassurance. Faith settles over Lisbon like a familiar blanket, heavy, warm, and difficult to remove. And wrapped in that sound, the richest city on earth goes on with its day, comforted by the belief that wealth, order, and divine favor are all part of the same arrangement. It feels permanent, which, in Lisbon, is exactly the illusion everyone needs. Lisbon's wealth had a sound, a smell, and a rhythm. It also had faces. You could see them everywhere once you knew how to look. They moved through the city quietly, doing work that needed to be done but was rarely acknowledged. Carrying water, cleaning homes, running errands, cooking meals they would never sit down to eat, standing behind chairs, waiting near doors, always nearby, rarely addressed directly. In the early 1700s, Lisbon had one of the largest enslaved populations in Europe. This fact did not shock the city. It blended in. Enslaved Africans were part of daily life in Lisbon, not hidden away, not confined to distant plantations. They walked the same streets, climbed the same hills, breathed the same smoky air. Their presence was so common that it stopped feeling remarkable. That is how normalization works. Most enslaved people in Lisbon worked in domestic roles. They belonged to households, not fields. This made slavery feel quieter here than in the colonies, less visibly violent, more polite, which of course did not make it kinder. Violence does not disappear just because it happens indoors. Enslaved men and women woke early and slept late. Their lives followed the schedules of other people. They were bought, sold, rented, inherited. Their value was discussed openly, often casually, like furniture that could speak. Markets existed for this trade, and people passed them without much comment. The transactions were part of the city's economy, as ordinary as buying fish or fabric. No one lowered their voice. No one pretended not to see. Children grew up watching this and learned quickly what was normal. Lisbon's slavery was deeply tied to its wealth, but the connection was rarely made explicit. Gold came from Brazil. Sugar came from plantations. Enslaved people made both possible. By the time the profits reached Lisbon, the labor behind them felt abstract. Distance softened responsibility. For wealthy families, owning enslaved people was a sign of status. It showed that you could afford help that did not leave, that you had control not just over property, but over lives. Servants came and went. Enslaved people stayed. This arrangement allowed comfort to feel effortless. Enslaved workers cooked meals that nobles praised without knowing the recipes. They cleaned palaces that guests admired. They raised children who would grow up inheriting both wealth and authority. Their labor disappeared into the smooth operation of elite life. If something went wrong, blame had somewhere to land. In poorer households, enslaved people worked alongside free laborers, often doing the same tasks for no pay. This created tension, resentment, confusion. If someone worked just as hard as you but was owned, what did that make you? Lisbon did not like to dwell on that question. The city developed ways of not seeing slavery clearly. Language helped. Enslaved people were referred to as servants in polite conversation. Their origins were mentioned vaguely, if at all. Violence was handled privately. Discomfort was managed through habit. Religion also played a role. Enslaved people were baptized, taught prayers, encouraged to attend services. This was presented as kindness, even salvation. It allowed owners to feel benevolent while maintaining control. You could own someone and still believe you were doing them a favor. This logic sat comfortably in a city that already linked wealth to divine approval. Enslaved people had little legal protection. Punishments were common and often severe. Escaping was difficult. Lisbon's hills, so defining in other ways, became traps. Narrow streets, watchful neighbors, a port full of ships, none of which would take you where you wanted to go. Freedom was visible but unreachable. And yet, enslaved people shaped Lisbon in ways the city rarely acknowledged. They brought languages, customs, music, food. They filled the city with sounds and rhythms that did not originate in Europe. Over time, these influences blended quietly into daily life. Lisbon absorbed them without credit. Some enslaved people managed to earn small amounts of money. Some purchased their freedom after years of labor. These stories existed, but they were treated as exceptions, not evidence of injustice. The system remained unquestioned. After all, the city was rich, and riches, in Lisbon, required forgetting. For most residents, slavery was not a moral issue. It was a practical one. People thought about it the way they thought about hills or crowds or noise. It was simply part of the city's shape. You navigated around it. You did not challenge it. The greatest cruelty of Lisbon's slavery may have been how ordinary it felt. There were no constant spectacles of suffering, no daily reminders forcing reflection. The system relied on quiet compliance, on the ability to look past what made life easier, that made it durable. Enslaved people were present at every level of the city except power. They knew its rhythms better than most. They climbed hills endlessly. They learned which bells meant danger and which meant routine. They saw wealth up close without touching it. They lived inside Lisbon's contradictions. At the docks, enslaved labor intersected with global trade. People unloaded goods produced by enslaved workers elsewhere, while enslaved people carried them onward. The circle was complete, even if no one drew it. Lisbon's prosperity rested on this foundation, but the city preferred not to examine it too closely. Looking too hard might disturb the illusion that wealth had arrived cleanly, deservedly, and illusions were valuable here. As time passed, slavery became background noise, like bells, always present, rarely questioned. It shaped the city's demographics, its labor, its culture, and its conscience. But because it did not disrupt daily routines, most people learned to accept it without comment. The richest city on earth told itself a quiet story, that suffering happened elsewhere, that order required hierarchy, that wealth justified its own existence. This story worked because it was never told out loud. Walking through Lisbon in the early 1700s, you would see enslaved people everywhere and still be told the city was blessed. You would hear sermons about charity while watching ownership in practice. You would live inside a system that depended on cruelty and rarely acknowledged it. And because it felt normal, it felt permanent. Lisbon moved forward like this, day after day. Gold continued to arrive. Churches continued to shine. Palaces continued to grow heavier with decoration. Enslaved people continued to work, quietly holding the city together. Most residents did not think of slavery as something that could end. It had always been there. It seemed as stable as the hills, which is perhaps the most dangerous thing a city can believe about injustice. For now, Lisbon did not see it as a fault line. It saw it as structure. And standing inside the richest city on earth, surrounded by movement, faith, and gold, few people imagined that the systems supporting their comfort might one day collapse, taking far more with them than anyone expected. Most people in Lisbon did not wake up thinking about gold. They woke up thinking about space. Space to stand, space to move, space to breathe without bumping into someone else's life. The poor made up the majority of the city, and their days began early. Not because they liked mornings, but because mornings belonged to work. If you waited too long, the best opportunities disappeared. The streets filled, the lines grew longer, the city became less forgiving. Homes were small, very small. One room often held an entire family, sometimes more. Beds were shared. Floors doubled the sleeping space. Privacy existed mostly in theory. You learned to ignore sounds. You learned not to ask questions. If you wanted quiet, you went outside, which says a lot about how crowded things were. Food was simple and repetitive. Bread, always bread. Sardines when they were cheap. Soup stretched thin to last another day. Wine watered down until it barely remembered being wine. Meat appeared occasionally, like a surprise guest who never stayed long. Hunger was not constant, but it was close enough to keep people alert. Work filled most hours. Bakers started before dawn, kneading dough in dim spaces thick with flour dust. Porters hauled goods uphill that had already traveled across oceans. Seamstresses bent over fabric until their backs curved into permanent shapes. Street vendors walked the same routes daily, shouting the same phrases, hoping today would be slightly better than yesterday. Noise followed them everywhere. Lisbon was loud at ground level. Carts rattled over stone. Animals complained. Children cried. Sellers argued. Someone was always calling out prices, prayers, insults, or warnings. Silence was rare and suspicious. The city pressed in on itself. For the poor, there was no clear separation between work and life. Home was where you slept. The street was where everything else happened. You cooked when you could. You rested when exhaustion won. You adapted constantly. Illness was a regular visitor. Crowded conditions meant sickness spread easily. Fevers, coughs, infections. No one needed medical terms to understand danger. When someone fell ill, the whole household adjusted. If they could not work, someone else had to. If no one could, hunger arrived quickly. There was no safety net, only neighbors. Communities formed out of necessity. People borrowed food, shared information, watched children, Arguments happened, but so did quiet acts of help. Survival required cooperation. Even when space and patience ran thin, the poor knew Lisbon intimately. They knew which streets flooded first, which markets closed early, which guards could be reasoned with, and which ones could not. They learned how to move through the city efficiently, avoiding trouble when possible and enduring it when not. They also knew how little the city belonged to them. Palaces loomed overhead, unreachable. Churches glowed with gold that felt distant and symbolic. Wealth existed all around them, but rarely for them. The richest city on earth still required constant calculation at the bottom. Can I afford bread today? Can I miss work if I'm sick? Can I risk angering the wrong person? These questions shaped daily decisions more than politics or empire ever did. Children worked early. Some helped parents. Others ran errands. Many learned trades informally, watching and copying. Education was rare and practical. Reading mattered less than strength, speed, and awareness. You learned quickly who held power over you. Women carried a heavy share of this labor. They cooked, cleaned, fetched water, managed households, and often worked outside the home as well. Their days were long and repetitive. Recognition was minimal. Expectations were constant. A woman's value was measured by endurance. Men worked until their bodies failed, then adjusted downward. Strong backs became weaker. Fast hands slowed. There was no retirement, only gradual disappearance from harder tasks. Old age was not a stage of life so much as a condition you hoped to reach without starving. Despite this, people found small comforts: a shared meal, a joke at the market, a drink after work. Laughter happened, sometimes loudly, sometimes at inappropriate moments. Humor helped. Complaining helped too. It created bonds. Lisbon's poor were not silent. They talked about prices, about unfairness, about rumors. They knew when shipments arrived and when shortages loomed. They sensed trouble before it became official. Their lives depended on paying attention. What they rarely did was imagine change. The system felt too large, too old, too embedded in stone and habit. You could improve your situation slightly, move to a better room, find steadier work, but escaping poverty entirely felt unrealistic for most. This did not mean people were hopeless. It meant they were practical. The poor did not dream of gold. They dreamed of stability, of fewer stairs, of roofs that did not leak, of children surviving to adulthood. These were reasonable goals in a city that demanded constant effort. Lisbon depended on these people completely. They baked the bread, moved the goods, cleaned the streets, built the houses, served the meals. Without them, the city's wealth would freeze in place, useless and heavy. And yet, they remained largely invisible in records and celebrations. When Lisbon celebrated success, it did so through churches, palaces, and royal events. The poor watched from edges and doorways. Their labor was assumed, not acknowledged. This imbalance created quiet resentment, but also resignation. You cannot fight a system you rely on to survive. You adapt instead. And so, day after day, the poor majority kept Lisbon alive. They climbed hills endlessly. They worked through heat and rain. They endured crowding and noise and exhaustion. They navigated a city that took far more than it gave. They did this without believing they were part of something extraordinary. If you asked them whether Lisbon was the richest city on earth, many might shrug. That wealth lived somewhere above them, behind walls and rituals. It did not change the weight of a basket or the price of bread. Richness, from below, looked theoretical. What mattered was getting through the day. As night fell, families returned to cramped rooms. Candles burned low. Conversations softened. Someone told a story. Someone else worried quietly about tomorrow. Outside, the city continued to hum. Lisbon did not rest easily, but it rested, and in that nightly pause, the poor majority did not think about empire or gold or destiny. They thought about sleep, about sore feet, about waking up and doing it all again. Because in the richest city on earth, survival was still a full-time job, and the people doing it best were the ones history would mention the least. Much of Lisbon's wealth moved quietly. It did not announce itself with ceremony or music. It moved through kitchens, stairwells, courtyards, and back rooms. It moved through people who were rarely seen. Servants formed the hidden machinery of the city. In wealthy homes, nothing functioned without them. Meals appeared. Floors stayed clean. Clothes were washed, repaired, and replaced. Fires burned safely. Children were supervised. Guests were impressed. This labor was constant and mostly unacknowledged. Servants woke before their employers and slept after them. Their lives followed other people's schedules. Bells rang and they responded. Instructions were given and they obeyed. Errors were noticed immediately. Success rarely was. Most servants lived where they worked. This reduced wages but increased control. Privacy was minimal. Freedom was conditional. Leaving required permission. Staying required endurance. The work was physically demanding. Carrying water up narrow staircases, scrubbing stone floors, preparing meals over open fires, hauling laundry to public wash areas, repeating tasks daily until they blurred together. Servants knew houses intimately. They knew which steps creaked, which doors stuck, which tempers were unpredictable. This knowledge gave them awareness but not authority. They were present but not equal. In Lisbon, service work overlapped with slavery. The city had a visible enslaved population, primarily of African origin. Portugal's empire made slavery a normalized presence, and Lisbon was one of Europe's most diverse cities as a result. Enslaved men and women worked in households, docks, workshops, and streets. They were everywhere, yet rarely acknowledged as individuals. Some carried goods, some cleaned homes, some sold items on behalf of owners. Others worked in skilled roles, cooks, craftsmen, assistants, yet remained legally property. Their clothing marked them, their status limited them, their vulnerability was constant. Freedom, for the enslaved, was uncertain and conditional. Manumission was possible but rare, often tied to long service, religious conversion, or the goodwill of an owner. Even then, former slaves entered a society that still viewed them with suspicion. Freedom did not guarantee security. Lisbon's streets reflected this layered labor system. A noble passed, followed by servants. A merchant traveled with assistants. Goods moved through hands that would never profit from them. Wealth flowed downward as orders, and upward as results. No one at the top lifted anything alone. Women dominated domestic service. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, and managed household rhythms. Their labor was intimate, physical, and exhausting. Abuse, verbal, emotional. Sometimes worse was a risk they could not easily escape. Complaints meant dismissal. Dismissal meant hunger. Men worked as porters, guards, drivers, and assistants. Their strength was used until it failed. Injuries ended careers abruptly. Replacement was easy. There was always someone else. Children served to young servants, ran errands, carried messages, fetched water, and learned obedience early. Childhood shortened quickly in service households. Play existed only in gaps between tasks. Despite this, bonds sometimes formed. Servants often knew their employers better than employers knew them. They witnessed arguments, secrets, illnesses, and weaknesses. They learned when to disappear and when to intervene. Trust developed unevenly, but it existed. This intimacy did not erase inequality. It complicated it. Enslaved workers formed communities of their own when possible. Shared language, shared memory, shared resilience. Cultural practices survived quietly, songs, rhythms, beliefs woven into daily routines. Lisbon absorbed these influences, even as it denied their sources. The city's soundscape reflected this hidden labor. Songs hummed while working, rhythms tapped out during repetitive tasks, voices carried through courtyards before dawn. Lisbon woke to the sound of people who owned nothing. Without servants and slaves, the city's image of refinement would collapse. Palaces would grow dirty, kitchens would fall silent, trade would slow, comfort would disappear, yet recognition remained minimal. Official records focused on owners, not workers. Architecture celebrated patrons, not builders. Paintings depicted wealth without the hands that maintained it. Invisible labor made visibility possible. This system created constant tension, fear of rebellion, fear of escape, fear of disorder. Control was enforced through law, custom, and threat, but also through routine. When labor becomes habit, resistance becomes risky. Still, resistance existed. It appeared in slowed work, in feigned misunderstanding, in small thefts, in running away, in preserving culture quietly, in survival itself. These acts rarely made history books, but they shaped daily reality. For those at the bottom, the city's wealth was not abstract. It was heavy laundry. It was endless stairs. It was long hours and watched movements. It was knowing that comfort belonged to someone else. And yet, Lisbon relied on them completely. The richest city on earth functioned because thousands of people labored without recognition, without rest, and often without freedom. Their presence filled every room, every street, every harbor. But when the city told stories about itself, their names were left out. They remained the quiet force beneath Lisbon's shiny central, exhausted and largely unseen. And in the soft light before dawn, as servants rose and enslaved workers prepared for another day, the city's wealth stirred again, supported by those who would never share in it. If the river was Lisbon's heartbeat, the streets were its lungs. Air moved through them in a constant exchange, warm, humid, full of life, full of smell. And in the markets, it all came together: the noise, the smells, the energy, and the quiet desperation of survival. Open-air markets were the city's veins, carrying food, goods, and information from one neighborhood to another. Here, you could smell the city in layers: fish, fresh and rotting, mixed with the sweetness of fruit and the sharp tang of spices imported from Africa, India, and Brazil. Bread baked hours ago released a yeasty warmth, mud squished beneath feet. Animals bleated, dogs roamed freely, always hopeful. Waste accumulated in corners and cracks, blending into the scent of life itself. Noise accompanied every movement. Street vendors shouted their wares, haggled over prices, warned of pickpockets, and occasionally shouted at each other for minor infractions. Children ran between legs, laughing or crying. Horses clattered down cobbled streets, wagons rattled with goods, and the occasional cart driver cursed under his breath as he navigated the narrow alleys. The markets were chaotic, but they were also necessary. Without them, the city would not function. People depended on them for daily meals, for the materials they could afford, and sometimes for scraps. The rich might walk through a market with curiosity, buying an exotic fruit or spice for display. But most people shopped with precision, selecting exactly what they could carry and cook before it spoiled. Smell was as important as sight here. You could gauge the day's quality by the aroma of bread and fish. Rotten food warned of scarcity. Spices hinted at trade routes far away. The Tagus brought water and saltiness to the air, carrying scents from the riverfront up into the alleys. Every street was alive, moving, speaking its own language. Merchants not only sold goods, they shared news, rumors, advice, warnings. The city's social life ran through these markets. People exchanged more than products. They exchanged information, influence, and sometimes subtle threats. And always, the poor were everywhere. Bakers needed dough while children begged for scraps. Fishmongers yelled to attract customers while carrying heavy loads uphill. Seamstresses haggled over fabric prices, their hands red with dye. Servants ran errands for their masters while also trying to manage their own survival. These streets were their theater and their prison at once. Markets were also a reminder of inequality. The rich might send a servant to fetch what they wanted or buy in bulk for a single extravagant meal, while the poor could only afford scraps, bread, or the occasional sardine. Wealth passed through these streets, but rarely lingered for those who needed it most. Crime, too, followed the smells and sounds. Pickpockets and petty thieves worked carefully in the crowded alleys, unnoticed among the push and pull of everyday life. The poor sometimes stole from one another, and sometimes from the wealthy, though doing so carried extreme risk. Justice in Lisbon was swift and public, and the consequences of being caught were brutal enough to encourage caution. Yet, despite the noise, the crowding, the smell, and the danger, the streets had a rhythm. People knew their timing. They learned which vendors arrived when. They knew which routes to take and which alleys to avoid. The city's chaos had patterns. Survival depended on noticing them. Food and commerce defined the sensory experience. But culture also thrived in these spaces. Music drifted from corner songs from African ports, Portugal, Italy, even Brazil, mixing into the market's ambient hum. Street performers balanced precariously on crates, juggling coins and attention. Conversations in multiple languages wove through the crowd: Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and others, reflecting Lisbon's role as a crossroads of the Atlantic world. Every element reminded Lisbon's residents of the city's fragile grandeur. Here was life in motion, vital but unpolished. Wealth existed in pockets, but it relied on human effort, patience, and endurance. The city smelled, tasted, and sounded like labor, not luxury. At the end of the day, markets quieted slowly. Stalls were packed up, barrels emptied, and the streets darkened. Candles flickered in narrow alleys. Fires burned low in homes. Workers returned to cramped quarters, tired but functional. Tomorrow, it would begin again, with the same smells, the same noises, the same rhythms, and through it all, the city breathed. It inhaled work and exhaled wealth, carrying the lives of the poor, the labor of the enslaved, and the curiosity of the wealthy along its winding streets. Lisbon was alive in a way that was messy, fragrant, and unmistakably human. The markets were not a show for tourists, they were the city itself. They reminded everyone, quietly and insistently, that wealth might glimmer, but survival was earned every day. And in Lisbon, that lesson was as tangible as the smell of fish or the squeal of a cartwheel in the mud. In Lisbon, women were everywhere, but they were rarely seen in the histories people tell. Yet they formed the backbone of the city's survival, quietly, endlessly, and under constant pressure. Most women in the early 1700s were tasked with work that never ended and was rarely rewarded. From the moment they woke, their days revolved around managing households, earning money, and keeping themselves and their families alive. In poor districts, this meant cooking over smoky fires, hauling water uphill, mending clothes, caring for children, and sometimes selling goods in the streets. Every day repeated, with little room for variation. For women in wealthier homes, the work looked different, but was no less consuming. They supervised servants, organized domestic routines, maintained appearances, and hosted events that showcased their family's status. Social grace, poise, and attention to detail were expected constantly. A misplaced dish, a mismanaged servant, or a poorly timed social faux pas could affect alliances, marriages, and social standing. The labor of management was invisible, but powerful, almost like trying to hold a castle together with your bare hands. Marriage was often a woman's primary economic strategy. Families arranged unions not for love, but for connection, inheritance, or social advantage. A woman's success could be measured by how well she negotiated this terrain, or how well her family positioned her. Those without advantageous marriages had to rely on work or family networks to survive. Widowhood was especially precarious. Suddenly, a woman's social and financial security could vanish overnight, leaving her dependent on relatives, charity, or her own resourcefulness. Children were both responsibility and labor. Older girls were expected to care for younger siblings, leaving less time for education or personal growth. Boys might be sent to work or apprenticeships, while girls learned practical skills, cooking, sewing, cleaning that would serve them for life. Knowledge was utilitarian, survival-oriented, and gendered. Women also had to navigate risk. Streets were crowded, dark, and uneven. Harassment, theft, and physical danger were constant threats. Legal protection existed in theory, but rarely in practice. A woman's reputation was fragile. Gossip could damage her prospects faster than poverty. And in a city like Lisbon, where wealth and visibility overlapped, discretion was essential. Some women resisted quietly. They created networks of support: neighbors, relatives, other women in service. They shared information, loaned resources, and protected each other from both circumstance and authority. Humor, cunning, and careful observation became vital tools. In these small, everyday acts, women exercised agency without attracting attention. In the market, women were indispensable. They sold produce, prepared food, carried goods, and haggled with skill honed by necessity. Many balanced multiple jobs, household duties at home, market labor by day, childcare throughout. Their work fueled Lisbon's economy, yet official records often ignored them. History celebrated merchants, traders, and nobility, while the women who kept the city functioning remained unnamed. In homes with enslaved people, women often managed both free and enslaved labor. They instructed, disciplined, and organized the household, while navigating the moral contradictions of ownership that they inherited from the system around them. Their labor extended into ethical management, balancing survival, propriety, and family expectations. This added a layer of complexity to already exhausting lives. Religion shaped women's lives, too. Daily routines intertwined with church attendance, festivals, and observance of fasts. Religious education emphasized obedience, modesty, and piety. While some women genuinely believed, for others, religion reinforced societal expectations. Church bells dictated schedules, prayers structured the day, and confession offered guidance or control. Faith was both refuge and constraint. Despite constraints, women found moments of personal agency. Some managed small businesses, sold homemade goods, or leveraged household skills to earn money. Some negotiated better living conditions, improved meals, or slightly eased the burdens of family members. These victories were subtle, often invisible, but crucial. They kept families afloat and preserved dignity. Even in the palaces, women's work was constant, but less acknowledged. They directed servants, monitored ceremonies, and ensured that appearances upheld family prestige. Their influence was indirect, but critical, shaping how wealth was displayed and perceived. A household could falter socially, not because the gold was gone, but because women failed to maintain its invisible order. Lisbon's women lived in a city of contrasts. The poor fought for survival in cramped, noisy spaces. The wealthy negotiated social and domestic power within invisible chains. Everyone's work was demanding. Everyone's freedom was limited in different ways. Everyone's labor mattered, but not equally recognized. By observing the city carefully, you notice patterns. Women's labor holds Lisbon together at every level. It sustains households, markets, palaces, and streets. Without it, the rhythm of the city would collapse. Yet this contribution is often invisible to the casual observer or to history itself. At night, women rest briefly, if they can. Candles flicker in small rooms. Streets empty slowly. In wealthier homes, rooms are quiet, but the work to maintain them continues the next day. In crowded districts, beds are shared, floors worn, and dreams brief. Sleep is a temporary pause, not an escape. In Lisbon, women learn endurance early. They adapt constantly. They navigate risk, manage labor, and shape the lives of those around them all. While occupying spaces society often ignores, their power is quiet, their labor invisible, and their survival a daily performance. The richest city on earth may glitter with gold, but it is women silent, tireless, and everywhere who keep its rhythm moving. Without them, the city would fall, not from earthquakes or storms, but from sheer lack of care. They are the hidden heartbeat beneath the bells, the gold, and the ships arriving from across the ocean. And Lisbon, for all its grandeur, moves forward every day because women make it do so without fanfare, without recognition, and almost without pause. Lisbon was never just a Portuguese city. Not really. It was a meeting place, a crossroads, a port that breathed in the world and exhaled opportunity, danger, and curiosity. Ships arrived constantly from the Atlantic, from Africa, India, Brazil, carrying goods, gold, spices, and people, some wealthy, some desperate, some hoping to find their fortune or escape their past. Merchants were the most visible outsiders. English, Dutch, Italian, and Spanish traders set up enclaves in the city, often in neighborhoods close to the river for easy access to docks. They spoke languages that blended into a cacophony of commerce. Money, orders, and rumors passed through them like currents, while local authorities watched warily. For foreigners, Lisbon was opportunity wrapped in complexity. There was profit to be made, of course, but also rules to learn, hierarchies to respect, and traditions that were not always obvious. Contracts were honored in principle, but enforcement could be unpredictable. Social navigation mattered as much as mathematics. Knowing when to bow, when to bribe, and when to leave a neighborhood could mean the difference between success and disaster. Outsiders lived temporarily in the city. Most did not settle permanently. Ships came and went. Cargoes arrived in bursts. Political climates shifted unpredictably. For a foreign merchant, Lisbon was both home and hotel, a place to operate, trade, and disappear again when opportunity or risk demanded. Foreigners also influenced Lisbon's culture. They brought their languages, foods, and fashions. You could see Italian fabrics in markets, hear Dutch phrases along the docks, taste English-style baked goods in certain neighborhoods. Music and customs merged subtly into city life, often without acknowledgement of their source. Lisbon absorbed the world while keeping a Portuguese veneer on everything. Trust was complicated. Locals viewed outsiders with suspicion, especially if they handled valuable cargo or bypassed local regulations. Foreign merchants relied on networks, favors, and alliances to survive. Missteps could be costly. Smuggling, bribery, and shortcuts existed, but so did informants, patrols, and local gossip. Every advantage had its risk. For the wealthy elite, foreign merchants were both essential and precarious. They provided goods that symbolized status: spices, textiles, rare objects, but their profit could also undermine local authority. Relationships were maintained carefully. Invitations to palaces, gifts for officials, and participation in religious observances helped legitimize their presence. It was a delicate dance, and missteps were remembered. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens saw foreigners less as opportunities and more as curiosities. Street vendors called out in strange accents, Sailors argued in unfamiliar languages, and shops displayed items that seemed exotic, almost magical. Outsiders reminded the locals that Lisbon's prosperity did not originate entirely within the city. It depended on the ocean, distant lands, and other cultures. Yet, outsiders often remained outsiders. Even successful merchants rarely became fully integrated. Neighborhoods separated them. Language, customs, and religion created invisible boundaries. Social acceptance was a privilege, hard-earned and often conditional. Many lived their entire lives passing through Lisbon, their influence lasting longer than their stay. Travelers, sailors, and itinerant workers added another layer. They moved quickly, carrying news, stories, diseases, and goods. Their presence was chaotic, sometimes unwelcome, and occasionally inspiring. Lisbon learned to tolerate this constant flow because commerce and empire demanded it. The city itself seemed to adjust to foreign presence. Signs in multiple languages appeared near ports and markets. Street names hinted at international influence. Certain taverns catered exclusively to foreigners, providing food, drink, and conversation in familiar tongues. Yet these spaces were clearly marked as temporary refuges, privileges, not rights. Even religion reflected this dynamic. Foreign traders attended churches, sometimes in their own chapels or language groups, yet the dominant narrative remained Portuguese and Catholic. Integration required adaptation. Outsiders could participate, but they rarely reshaped the larger structure. This constant movement of people created a rhythm to the city. The arrival of a ship meant work, excitement, and sometimes danger. A foreigner's success could ripple outward, influencing local prices, labor demand, and gossip. And when the ship sailed away, Lisbon returned to its baseline, the city itself unchanged, though subtly enriched or irritated by the encounter. In short, foreigners were vital to Lisbon, yet all was slightly removed. They brought wealth, novelty, and risk. They formed communities within the city, while remaining partly alien. Their presence reminded Lisbon that the world was larger than its hills and palaces, but also that the city's wealth allowed it to manage, control, and contain outsiders without surrendering authority. Lisbon's identity, therefore, was both local and global, static and dynamic. It was a city of contrasts, permanent structures, temporary residence, concentrated wealth, diffuse labor, silence in palaces, chatter in markets. Foreigners amplified these contrasts, offering commerce, culture, and complexity, while never truly claiming Lisbon as home. And through all this, the city thrived. Merchants haggled, sailors unloaded goods, nobles observed with mild curiosity, servants and enslaved workers carried heavy loads. The river continued to move, carrying ships to and from ports across the Atlantic. Every newcomer left a trace, sometimes faint, sometimes lasting, but the city itself remained its own entity, rich, bustling, layered, and perpetually aware of the outside world, even as it maintained a carefully constructed internal order. Lisbon was both open and closed, a city that invited the world but measured the cost of entry. And for the people inside, whether local or foreign, wealthy or laboring, the message was clear. Survival and success depended not only on ambition, but on understanding the rules of a city that operated on appearance, hierarchy, and the ever-present hum of commerce. Lisbon's wealth often announces itself in gold, palaces, and imported goods. But for most people, richness is measured differently. In the 1700s, it was measured in bread, wine, and small moments of comfort. Food was the daily rhythm of life. For the poor majority, meals were predictable and simple. Bread, sardines, occasional beans, maybe a bit of cheese if the market was generous. Olive oil, salt, and vinegar flavored what little variety existed. These were not feasts, they were necessities, repeated with careful precision. Every crumb mattered. Bread was counted, shared, and stretched over hours or even days. Hunger was never far, so eating was as much about survival as pleasure. Wine played a curious role. Even those with little money often drank it. Water could be unsafe, but wine, even watered down, was reasonably reliable. Taverns served as social hubs, offering warmth, conversation, and the occasional bit of levity. Patrons might not be rich, but for a few hours, a mug of wine and the company of neighbors made life lighter. The city smelled faintly of yeast and grapes, especially near taverns and kitchens, giving Lisbon a comforting, living scent even amid hardship. Wealthier households had more complex meals, but even they followed strict routines. Spices from Africa, India, and Brazil flavored sauces and meat. Fresh fish arrived daily from the Tagus. Rice, sugar, citrus, and imported wines signaled status. However, much of this richness was performative. Meals were prepared not only to nourish but to impress visitors, maintain appearances, and reinforce hierarchy. Rarely did the family taste every luxury they displayed. Wealth was meant to be seen, not always consumed. Cooking itself was labor-intensive. Open hearths, wood fires, and heavy pots dominated kitchens. Servants worked early and late, chopping, stirring, and cleaning. Smoke and steam-filled rooms. Floors became slick with water and spills. Heat and exhaustion were constants. The smells of frying fish, roasting meats, and simmering stews mingled with sweat, dust, and the occasional whiff of mold from crowded homes. Despite the hardship, small pleasures were deeply valued. A warm loaf, fresh from the oven, a cup of wine shared among friends, a rare piece of sugar in tea, or a slice of citrus in dessert. These moments were anchors in the relentless rhythm of labor and survival. People savored them quietly, with gratitude that was both practical and emotional. Even the timing of meals mattered. Religious fasting days punctuated the calendar. Lent, feast days, and holy days dictated what could be eaten, when, and with whom. This rhythm provided structure. It reminded people that, even in scarcity, life had patterns. Rituals gave ordinary actions meaning. Food was also a subtle marker of status. Poor families shared meals in cramped quarters, often in silence, attentive to waste. Middle-class households displayed modest abundance, balancing generosity with caution. The elite dined in relative comfort, sometimes in public view, as a form of social theater. Every bite conveyed a message, whether about survival, piety, or prestige. Wine and food extended beyond necessity. They were tools for connection. Tavern tables hosted conversations about work, gossip, politics, and rumor. A shared loaf or mug of wine built trust. Merchants discussed trade. Servants compared work. Enslaved people maintained secret practices, sharing small cultural tastes amidst daily routines. The flavors of Lisbon reflected the movement of the world, absorbed and transformed locally. Even within scarcity, people adapted. Leftovers were creatively reused. Bread became porridge or crumbs in stew. Fish bones added flavor to soups. Every ingredient was a resource. Culinary improvisation was an essential skill. Comfort extended beyond taste. Physical routines, sitting in the sun on a stairway, listening to church bells, watching the river provided respite. A shared joke, a warm blanket, a child's laughter, or a brief nap in a quiet corner mattered immensely. Small touches created pockets of peace in a city otherwise dominated by labor, noise, and hierarchy. In wealthier homes, comforts were rarer in their simplicity, but more abundant in options. Heavy tapestries kept warmth in. Cushioned chairs offered respite. Candlelight allowed evening reading or quiet conversation. Even here, routines mattered. Comfort was structured, controlled, and often performative. Luxury was a signifier, not a necessity. In Lisbon, food, wine, and small comforts tied the city together. They reflected status and survival, hierarchy and humanity. Every loaf, every sip, every stolen moment of warmth was part of the city's rhythm. People lived inside these small pleasures as much as they lived under wealth or oppression. For those watching the Tagus from a sunlit window, baking bread, or haggling over market fish, richness was not in gold or palaces. It was in what could be touched, tasted, and shared. It was practical, sensory, fleeting but deeply felt. And in a city as crowded and uneven as Lisbon, these small comforts became essential. They were the glue that allowed survival, endurance, and even joy amidst inequality. The richest city on earth could sparkle with imported wealth and palatial grandeur, but for most people, richness was measured in daily routines. Modest meals, a warm hearth, and the fleeting satisfaction of small successes. The city demanded labor and patience, but it also offered quiet moments that reminded residents why enduring its challenges was worth it. And for a while, that was enough. Lisbon in the early 1700s looked confident. Streets bustled, palaces gleamed. Ships arrived daily, loaded with wealth that seemed endless. Bells rang constantly. Markets hummed. The city appeared permanent, unshakable, as if its riches had been there forever and would remain indefinitely. But permanence, of course, is an illusion. Most residents never paused to consider it. They moved through crowded alleys and hills, past palaces and churches, consumed by routine. The wealthy thought their gold, art, and influence were shields against disorder. The poor, accustomed to constant challenge, assumed that the city would always find a way to sustain them, more, that they would adapt if it failed. Everyone, in their own way, ignored fragility. Physical structures hinted at weakness if you looked closely. Buildings were packed tightly together. Narrow streets cut between them. Staircases rose relentlessly. Wooden beams creaked beneath the weight of additional floors. Houses leaned against one another like careful arrangements of cards, supported by trust and neglect alike. Construction standards varied. Some palaces were solid, built of stone and tile, but even these had hidden flaws. The poorer districts were more vulnerable. Floors bowed, walls cracked, roofs leaked. Fires could spread in minutes, fueled by timber, thatch, and dense urban layout. Yet daily life proceeded as if risks were negligible. People assumed accidents were rare, or at least manageable. Open flames were everywhere. Kitchens burned fires for cooking. Candles illuminated homes. Torches lit streets and ceremonies. Heat and light were constant companions and constant hazards. It was a miracle nothing worse had happened yet, but no one expected disaster. If you lived in Lisbon, you believed the city had survived everything so far. Why doubt it now? Even wealth could not prevent vulnerability. Gold, silver, and fine goods shone brightly, but they were heavy, immobile, and irrelevant in certain crises. Palaces could burn, ships could sink, markets could collapse. All the glitter in the city could vanish in a moment, leaving nothing but walls, rubble, and human survival. Social structures, too, were precarious. Slavery, servant labor, and inequality sustained the daily functioning of the city. If enough of that labor failed through sickness, rebellion, or accident, wealth and comfort would falter. People rarely thought about this. Systems that seemed permanent often relied on invisible, fragile mechanisms, maintained quietly by those with the least power. Pride was another form of blind spot. Lisbon's elite displayed wealth with confidence. Palaces rose, churches gleamed, and streets were maintained, at least painted as well maintained. The city told itself a story that riches guaranteed stability. The grandeur suggested permanence, even when foundations were shaky. Appearances reassured, even as risk lingered unseen. The river, the Tagus, seemed steady. Ships sailed in with exotic cargo, and sailors carried news of the wider world. But rivers change, tides shift, storms rise, floods arrive unexpectedly. Lisbon's lifeline was reliable, yes, but not invincible. Residents trusted it anyway, because it had been so consistent for generations. Daily life reinforced the illusion. Children learned routines. Parents navigated markets. Servants moved goods. Nobles inspected palaces, and priests rang bells. Everything followed a rhythm that seemed eternal. Emergencies were small, temporary, absorbed by habit. The city lulled itself into complacency. Even human psychology contributed. People imagine permanence because it makes survival easier. To act as if disaster is imminent is exhausting. Lisbon's residents, rich and poor alike, assumed continuity. They assumed the hills would hold, the houses would stand, and the Tagus would not rise beyond its banks. Assumptions, repeated daily, became reality. But the truth is subtle. Cities are fragile systems. Lisbon, densely packed, reliant on imported wealth, steeped in inequality, and saturated with combustible materials, rested on borrowed time. Its appearance of strength was constructed as carefully as its gold-leafed altars and chandeliers. Yet no one built with catastrophe in mind. No one imagined a moment when everything, the rhythm, the hierarchy, the comfort, might abruptly stop. Inhabitants ignored warning signs. Leaning walls, unstable staircases, overloaded buildings, they were inconveniences, not omens. The poor adapted daily to discomfort. The rich considered it aesthetic or temporary. Systems seemed self-reinforcing. Belief in permanence made fragility invisible. And so Lisbon continued. Streets were crowded, markets noisy, palaces gleaming, bells ringing. Life proceeded with charm, routine, and an unexamined confidence. The city seemed immortal, as if the hills themselves could hold everything in place indefinitely. But under the surface, the tension grew quietly. Fire hazards waited in kitchens and alleys. Heavy loads threatened crumbling beams. Wealth relied on labor that could disappear. And the earth, silent beneath the city, remembered patterns older than commerce, more powerful than gold. Lisbon moved through its days unaware. The sun rose, candles flickered, and ships docked along the Tagus. People assumed tomorrow would follow today. They assumed that their rituals, routines, and routines of comfort were eternal. And in that unexamined confidence, Lisbon rested on the edge of something larger than wealth, larger than hierarchy, larger than human control. Because sometimes cities can feel eternal, and sometimes they are not. It began like any other morning. The streets of Lisbon smelled of damp stone, baking bread, and the Tagus, heavy with salt and fog. Church bells chimed gently, not in alarm, but in routine. Candles flickered in windows and homes, smoke curling up stairways, marking the start of daily life. The city breathed in rhythm, merchants preparing for the day, bakers kneading dough, porters carrying crates to docks, children scurrying toward lessons or errands. It was All Saints' Day. Families dressed in their best clothes. Candles were lit on home altars. Churches filled with congregations, hushed and reverent. Choirs practiced quietly, voices merging with the murmurs of prayer. Every detail followed tradition, from the placement of flowers to the tone of greetings on the streets. It was a day meant to honor memory and reflection, a day that felt stable, familiar, inevitable. Lisbon did not know it was about to be interrupted. In homes across the city, servants carried water, lit stoves, and arranged breakfast. Women adjusted children's clothing, checked doors, and ensured fires were safely tended. The poor prepared simple meals of bread and wine. The rich gathered silver trays and polished goblets. Everything seemed ordinary. Nothing hinted at what lay beneath the surface. Ships rocked gently in the Tagus, their masts tapping against masts of neighboring vessels. Sailors secured cargo. Merchants shouted instructions. The river, so often a symbol of stability, moved as it always had, calm, endless, and deceptively reliable. Even the hills appeared steady. Lisbon's slopes, its steep streets lined with houses, palaces, and churches, seemed permanent. People climbed stairways and alleys without thought. Dogs padded along cobbles. Birds sang in corners of tiled roofs. The city seemed tranquil, almost sleepy. And then, without warning, the ground shifted. At first, it was subtle, a tremor that might have been imagined, a swaying lamp, a rattling dish, a shiver in the floorboards. People paused, looked around, exchanged puzzled glances. Bakers clutched counters, women steadied children, merchants gripped crates. The river remained calm, betraying nothing, and then it grew. The tremor became motion. Stone buildings groaned, tiles slipped, church bells clanged wildly, but not in rhythm. Sound collided with sound, dissonant and chaotic. Palaces that had seemed immutable wavered. Wooden shutters banged. Smoke poured from hearths as flames danced unpredictably. Fear spread quietly at first, then loudly. Children screamed, dogs barked, carts tipped. People ran, unsure where to go, trying to navigate alleys that no longer felt safe. Every familiar structure suddenly seemed foreign. Every routine dissolved. The city that had appeared eternal was not. Every street, every staircase, every crowded quarter shifted beneath its inhabitants. People realized, almost immediately, that wealth meant nothing here. Gold, silver, tapestries, imported luxuries, they were irrelevant. Only presence, only survival, only response mattered now. Some took to the streets, where falling masonry threatened them. Some tried to shelter indoors, only to find walls cracking and ceilings trembling. Servants and enslaved workers attempted to assist those around them, often risking themselves for others. Yet there was no guarantee anyone would escape. And yet, in this chaos, patterns emerged. Survival depended on quick thinking, movement, and adaptation. The city's poor, accustomed to narrow streets, hills, and crowded homes, moved with a strange advantage. Agility and familiarity with obstacles gave them a chance. Wealthy families, accustomed to order and appearances, stumbled in uncertainty. Palaces offered no refuge from shaking stone. Time stretched strangely. Seconds felt like minutes. Doors jammed, stairs crumbled, candles fell, fires sparked, dust filled the air. The smells of bread, wine, and smoke became sharp, acrid, and inescapable. The Tagus, so often a symbol of life and stability, now reflected the trembling city like a mirror gone wrong. Amid the chaos, human reactions varied. Some froze in disbelief. Some ran blindly. Some shouted for loved ones. Some acted instinctively, pulling children away from collapsing beams or into open courtyards. Heroism and panic intertwined. Luck and preparation mattered equally. And then, as suddenly as it began, the first wave of stillness arrived, an eerie pause after trembling. People dared to breathe. They dared to look around. The city, though shaken, had not yet collapsed entirely, but the illusion of permanence was gone. Lisbon understood, in the most immediate and terrifying way, that wealth and hierarchy, gold and power, were fragile. For centuries, Lisbon had existed on confidence, habit, and routine. That morning, all of it ended quietly at first, then violently. The earthquake had begun, and nothing would ever look the same. When the shaking stopped, Lisbon was not the city it had been. The streets were unrecognizable. Cobbled alleys had buckled. Staircases collapsed. Buildings that had seemed eternal lay in rubble. Palaces, once symbols of confidence and order, were hollowed shells. Church spires had toppled. Gold leaf melted in fires sparked by broken candles. The city's glittering wealth, the very thing it had defined itself by, was suddenly irrelevant. Survivors wandered through the chaos, stunned, searching for family, friends, and anything that could be salvaged. The poor and the wealthy alike were exposed, stripped of the protections their social positions had provided. The same alleys that had pressed in on the poor, forcing them to navigate crowded streets daily, now offered open space if you could move through the debris without injury. The streets that had seemed orderly and bustling were now jagged mazes of broken wood, stone, and shattered lives. Human endurance became the measure of value. Some pulled neighbors from rubble. Some searched for children in collapsed homes. Some scavenged for water, food, and makeshift shelter. Survival did not distinguish between social class. Gold could not buy safety, nor could a palace prevent death. For a moment, everyone's place in society felt equalized by necessity. The poor, accustomed to crowded and dangerous conditions, often fared surprisingly well. Familiarity with navigating narrow alleys, carrying heavy loads, and improvising solutions gave them an unexpected advantage. Women, who had managed households, children, and labor for years, applied the same skills to rescue, organization, and comfort in the aftermath. Their quiet endurance became the city's foundation, but loss was total. Lives were destroyed, families separated, markets ruined. Fires and collapsed buildings eliminated homes and livelihoods. The riverfront, which had brought wealth and sustenance, now reflected chaos, debris floating atop water that had once carried prosperity. Rebuilding would take years, and even then, nothing would be the same. The palaces could be repaired, but the city's collective sense of invincibility had been shattered. Streets would be realigned, houses reconstructed, and the Tagus would continue to float, but Lisbon's identity as the richest city on earth was forever altered. Its wealth, once a permanent background hum, had proven fleeting. Memory became a form of survival. Stories of bravery, quick thinking, and unexpected solidarity circulated. People remembered who helped whom, which streets collapsed first, which buildings survived, and which traditions had endured despite catastrophe. History, often focused on rulers, merchants, and gold, would eventually record the earthquake as a turning point, but the lives of the poor majority, the laborers, servants, and women who sustained daily life, remained the invisible backbone of survival. In the aftermath, new hierarchies emerged, shaped by who could endure, who could organize, and who could adapt. Old wealth mattered less than resilience. Gold, silver, and luxury furnishings could not buy food, water, or safety. Power shifted, at least temporarily, to those capable of practical action. Yet even in ruin, life continued. Markets slowly reopened, improvised kitchens emerged, and communities formed makeshift shelters. People discovered new routines. Children played among rubble cautiously. Families rebuilt homes with whatever materials were available. The city itself, resilient despite everything, began to pulse once more, slowly, unevenly, and uncertainly. Lisbon's story teaches a quiet, profound lesson. Wealth is temporary. Structures may crumble, gold may melt, and power may vanish. What endures is human endurance, the ability to adapt, and the connections between people. Comfort, hierarchy, and luxury are fragile. Labor, courage, and care are essential. The richest city on earth, for all its glitter and grandeur, proved no exception. Its brilliance was temporary, and its survival depended not on gold, but on people ordinary, determined, and resilient. The earthquake revealed this truth with clarity. Material wealth fades, but human perseverance remains. For the survivors walking among ruins, every step was a reminder. The city was alive, but differently. Wealth no longer defined it. The river still flowed, hills still rose. Life went on, and the people of Lisbon, rich and poor alike, learned the most important lesson of all. Stability is not given, it is earned, daily, in sweat, care, and courage. The city would rebuild. It would rise again, slowly, imperfectly, and carefully. Gold would return, ships would arrive, markets would bustle. But Lisbon, the richest city on earth, would never forget the morning that wealth meant nothing, and survival meant everything. The Tagus River still flows. It always has, and it always will, carrying ships, currents, and the quiet pulse of life along its banks. Lisbon rises along its slopes, rebuilt again and again, altered each time by history, weather, and human choice. But beneath the surface of stone, water, and memory, the city holds lessons that are timeless. Wealth is not security. Gold, silver, tapestries, palaces, and imported luxuries dazzle, impress, and create illusions of permanence. Lisbon in the 1700s glittered as the richest city on earth, yet one morning revealed that all the riches in the world cannot shield a city or a person from vulnerability. Luxury may impress the eye, but survival depends on far humbler things: care, skill, endurance, and community. Cities themselves are fragile systems. Streets, buildings, and markets depend on labor that is often invisible. Servants, enslaved people, women managing households, and the poor majority carried the weight of Lisbon's wealth, its rhythm, and its day-to-day function. Without them, the glittering image of the city would collapse, even without earthquakes. Power and status can be impressive, but the unseen hands of countless individuals are what make society function and what make recovery possible when disaster strikes. Human endurance is the constant. Wealth, hierarchy, and luxury are temporary. Buildings crumble, palaces burn, gold melts, lives can be lost in an instant, but people endure, they adapt, they rebuild, they find ways to live amidst scarcity, loss, and chaos. Lisbon survived because ordinary people, not gold or palaces, carried it forward. This lesson is both simple and subtle. It does not demand drama, nor does it offer spectacle. It whispers in the alleyways, markets, and courtyards. It lingers in the rhythm of daily life, the hum of the Tagus, the sway of tiled roofs, and the quiet resilience of a city shaped as much by labor, endurance, and adaptation as by wealth. There is also a kind of beauty in fragility. Understanding it does not diminish wonder, it enhances it. Lisbon's slopes, hills, and riverbanks are still breathtaking. The bells still ring, markets hum, life continues. But the city asks its residents and its observers to recognize the delicate balance upon which beauty, comfort, and security rest. Wealth can be intoxicating. It can shape lives, cities, and empires. But Lisbon teaches that it is a fleeting companion. It can impress, it can inspire, but it can vanish in moments. Human effort, endurance, and attention are far more reliable measures of lasting impact. The city's memory preserves both glitter and ruin, showing that fragility and resilience coexist. As night falls, the Tagus reflects a pale moon, the sails of distant ships catching faint light. The river carries echoes of centuries, wealth flowing in, labor moving constantly, lives unfolding in shadow and sun. Palaces and churches stand once more, but so do the quiet homes of those who keep the city alive. They remind us that history is not made by gold alone, but by the people who endure, act, and care. So, as you rest tonight, let Lisbon's story linger softly in your mind. Wealth may shimmer, but it is never permanent. Cities, empires, and fortunes rise and fall. What lasts is human resilience, adaptation, and quiet perseverance. The richest city on earth once trembled and revealed its truth, and centuries later, its lesson remains. Beauty, order, and survival are sustained not by gold, but by the countless unseen hands and hearts that carry life forward. Sleep, then, with that thought. Wealth is temporary, endurance is eternal, and the city, in all its imperfection and fragility, continues to breathe. By the early 1700s, Lisbon stood at the peak of its power, overflowing with gold, faith, and contradiction. It was a city where belief shaped every street, every ritual, and every life, reminding us that even in the richest city on earth, certainty was often fragile, and faith came at a price. If you enjoyed exploring this quieter, hidden side of history, take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more calm, immersive journeys into the past, and leave a comment below, sharing which part of Lisbon's story stayed with you the most. For more stories like this, Be sure to check out the other videos on the channel, which one uncovers another overlooked chapter of history, perfect for relaxing, reflecting, or drifting off to sleep. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next journey through time.